We'll get started now. Good afternoon and welcome to the Atlantic Council's Energy and Economic Summit. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm the director of the Atlantic Council's Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security, and we're here to talk about a major set of security issues in the turbulent Middle East, as the title says. We have a very distinguished panel to address both the urgent crisis issues that we're all well aware of, especially with the recent events, but also I think, and key here is looking at some of the longer term issues and getting a longer term perspective on these developments because they continually change and they are moving quite quickly. Last year at this time, we convened in this room and we thought the Middle East was turbulent then. Since then, we've had a number of developments, most of them creating additional security concerns, but one or two of them just more positive. I'll start with the relatively more positive one, which is the nuclear P5+1 nuclear agreement with Iran. I think we're all well aware of that, and that has to be considered a positive development, but we'll discuss that in the panel, but also a lot of other concerning developments. We have an ongoing war in Yemen, which doesn't look like it's stopping anytime soon and is incurring significant humanitarian issues and other issues. We have Russia now involved in the Syrian conflict, which creates complications, but potentially also opportunities. And of course, we have a massively expanded impact of ISIS with demonstrating in a very clear fashion. It did so earlier this year when it launched attacks on 3 continents in one day, but the Paris attacks demonstrate anew that it has a very significant reach and has to be dealt with on an urgent and sustainable basis. And in some ways, ISIS is unfortunately realizing the true potential of terrorist organizations, which is to terrorize. And that's happening. I'm getting ongoing reports from the United States about this. But on top of those issues, we also have a major and historic refugee crisis resulting from the developments and others that I've addressed already. We have the conflict in Syria and Iraq itself. We have Sinai and Libya, so no shortage of extremely difficult and concerning security issues that involve a lot of our interests, our country's interests, the United States, Europe, the Middle East, Turkey, all of our interests are involved. And so the Atlantic Council is doing a lot of work on these issues. The Hariri Center is doing work on developing a Middle East strategy framework under former National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley and former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. There'll be more discussion of that at this summit, so stay tuned very shortly. Fred Hoff has developed a body of work on Syria, a very, very consistent and strong voice from Washington on a lot of the issues. We'll hear from Fred shortly. General Jones and I were just in the Gulf for about a week and have a pretty fresh perspective from the voices there on these issues. So a lot of ongoing work, and I think what I'd like to address today are the policy responses to all of these issues, but also the strategies. I mean, how do we get to a point where we know that our policy responses are actually achieving the long-term objectives that we seek and are not just reactions, either reactions out of emotion or for other reasons. And I think those policies and strategies, we should discuss those from the U.S. perspective, from the European perspective, from the Middle East perspective, and whatever other perspectives are relevant. And we also have to make sure we talk about root causes. We can't just postpone these questions for another day and for another generation. And then lastly, I think, is there room for a positive vision in this discussion? Does that have a role in areas like countering violent extremism? How can that play a role in these issues? And so a lot on the plate. This panel will answer all of those issues decisively, and everything will be solved. And with that, I'd like to hear from our panelists on these issues, and I think I'll start with General Jones, not only because he's my boss, but he's a lot bigger than I am.
I thought this panel was going to be about peace breaking out in the Virgin Islands, but I guess not.
One last thing, sorry. This panel is on the record. We are tweeting from the hashtag AC Summit, as we are for the rest of this, and please turn your phones to silent if that's possible. Thank you. Sorry.
Well, Barry, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I'll try to be very, very brief. We have a distinguished panel, and I think that the answer to Barry's question is where have we come since last year, and the answer is very clearly we're in a bigger, we have bigger challenges than we thought we would have at last year's conference. The region is clearly at a tipping point with all of the problems that Barry mentioned. From a U.S. perspective, having just spent a week in the Gulf and talking to various leaders, I'm more concerned about the fact that the Gulf and my country in particular are kind of talking past each other in terms of feelings and attitudes. And I would summarize it by simply saying that I think going back to when the United States developed its own energy supply lines and potential for the future, we inadvertently created question marks in the Gulf about whether the traditional relationship of oil for energy that has lasted for the last 40 years would continue. And I think most of the leaders in the region have come up with the answer that the answer is no, that it's not going to continue. And we've been struggling with that dialogue, I think, ever since. The current brutal civil war in Syria and the red lines that were not enforced a few years ago, when Assad used chemical weapons on his own people, really stands in, I think, pretty much sharp focus as to an opportunity that perhaps was missed. It is the epicenter of the future defining struggle between modernity and extremism, and it's playing out throughout the region. As a retired general officer, I think it's a mistake for any country to say we're going to not do certain things. You want to keep all your options on the table. I'm on record as having said that if you want to defeat ISIS and if you want to even begin to solve the Syrian problem, we've already missed some key milestones. But to try to do this through air power alone is probably, at best, a good way to prolong the conflict as opposed to shorten it. And even then, you may not be successful. And so ultimately, in the short term, ISIS is a growing problem, obviously, and we mourn the tragic loss of life, innocent life in Paris, and I think we all stand in solidarity with the French people today in particular. But at the end of the day, we have to come to grips with what is it that you have to do to achieve your goals. In the region that we've just come from, I kept hearing the words existential threat voiced by many people. Existential threat. We believe, and this is a quote, we believe that Iran is an existential threat. Well, if you believe that, then it seems to me that you should be doing something about it within each country. And at a conference, I invoked the logic of 1949 when European countries that had spent the better part of a century fighting one another decided with the United States that there was an existential threat called the Soviet Union. And out of that, NATO was formed, and we all know the results of that in terms of the Cold War. And so at I just propose the idea that if you really believe that you're facing an existential long-term threat to your survival, then perhaps it would be time to start thinking about a similar type of organization comprised of like-minded Gulf states. And I also suggested that if that were ever to come to pass, and I'm not naive to think that that's not without its own degrees of difficulty, but so is NATO. But if that were to come to pass, I think the United States would have an easier time dealing with security policy with one organization as opposed to 12 to 15 different ones. So it's not necessarily a solution, but when you use the term existential threat, I think that those are alarming words that we should take seriously, and that the countries who feel that their existence is threatened should be willing to do something about that. So I think there are three strategic priorities here that face us. One is immediately and as soon as possible defeating ISIS. I don't think you're going to do that without putting boots on the ground. In the U.S., there's an aversion to that, and as publicly represented by our president. But nobody, nobody, at least in my view, should be thinking that the U.S. by itself is going to do this. I think that the days when the U.S. kind of comes in and overwhelmingly and says, "Okay, everybody else stay out of the way, we'll take care of this," I think those days are gone. But I think it's if you really want to get rid of ISIS, you need to be prepared to do what's necessary, and that involves more than 50 special forces soldiers on the ground in Syria, who are defined by what they're not going to do rather than by what they're going to do. So defeating ISIS militarily, economically, and in the battle of ideology and ideas, I think is important. Filling the power vacuum that has been created by this fairly recent belief that the United States is, in fact, rebalancing towards Asia and has less interest in the Gulf. If that's a perception, we should do something about it, because I think it's terribly dangerous. And if it's reality, then we should correct it, because the Middle East is still, in my view, the most dangerous place in the world. And then I think it will never be enough to simply send in military force without an accompanying economic and political development plan that is almost simultaneously following whatever military action we choose. So it's still very much up in the air as to what is going to happen. But I'm convinced that if we're serious about it, we can find common cause, certainly where ISIS is concerned, and then the threat of the longer-term Iran will have to be addressed collectively as well.
Thank you very much, General Jones. You certainly put a lot of issues on the table and a lot of sharp proposals and commentary on the issues that I raised. I think I might mix it up a little bit and go towards the end to Soner to hear his views on these same issues. Soner?
I'll be happy to chime in, and I think so much has happened since we had this conversation last year. The region has changed, but the biggest change in the regional dynamics is the entry of Russia into Syria. That was not the case last year when we gathered here, and I think Russia's entry not only flips the balance of power on the ground in favor of the Assad regime, and also has the potential to eradicate the middle in Syria, because the Russian airstrikes are mostly targeting the middle, meaning not the Assad regime, not ISIS, but everything in the middle. And when I say the middle, I don't necessarily mean good, but good and bad in the middle. But obviously that could cast the conflict to us down the road if these airstrikes are successful, that Syria will be a binary conflict, which it has never been, between Assad and ISIS, at which point nobody's going to line up behind ISIS, of course. So that means the long-term survival of the Assad regime. Even if Assad does not stay in the picture, he's part of a transition, he's phased out. His government is going to be around. Those who support him will be around, because they have now Russia as a steadfast support. So I think that's really changed the dynamics in Syria. I think Russia's entry will not only debilitate the middle militarily, but also ideologically drive the middle towards the extremes, towards the ISIS extreme, especially because ISIS rhetoric that this is a war between religions and that there is a crusade and you have an Orthodox Christian power which enters the war with religious rhetoric will probably enable more ISIS recruitment from the center, if not the entire center. So that's really one big change. And I think in terms of the regional implications of this, of course, if the international community is pushing for a negotiated settlement, that's increasingly seems to be the case. Whether or not that's realized, we'll see. But it will bring forward a situation, I think, in which Turkey might have to come to terms with the continuation of the Assad regime. Turkey's policy since 2011 has been single-handedly focusing on ousting the Assad regime. Turkey has done a lot to this end. Nothing has succeeded. So my sense of it is that Russia's entry will provide Turkey with a reality check. In fact, this might be Turkey's only reality check in Syria thus far, and also going forward. Russia is Turkey's, of the dozen or so neighbors that Turkey has, including maritime neighbors across the Black Sea, there's only one neighbor that Turkey is really afraid of, and that's Russia. And that's for historic reasons. Turkey has fought Russia maybe from 1470s, when the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire became neighbors, until 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, the collapse of the Russian Empire. Ottoman Empire and Turkish Ottomans and Russian Empire fought 19 wars at least. Guess who started all of them? The Russians. And guess who lost all of them? The Turks. So Turkey is not going to push against Russia for whatever reason. It will avoid a conflict. And I think Russia's entry significantly changes Turkey's behavior, because this is the first time Turkey sees a serious contender to its policy. So I would suggest that Turkey will come down a notch in the next year. Its goal will no more be the ouster of Assad regime. It won't pronounce this perhaps so clearly, but I think its goal will be making sure that Turkey-backed rebels are not entirely swept out of northern Syria, because that will be defeat for Turkey, that its proxies or groups that it has backed will be defeated and those areas will be captured by the Assad regime. So that suggests Turkey now has to strengthen its own hand in the Syrian theater, because it faces both Iran and Russia, but more significantly, Russia with historic as well as current military capabilities. So I think it will push Turkey to work closer with the United States and with its European allies. And I think in this regard, the government in Ankara will leverage three factors to bolster its position, its new position in Syria, which is preventing the fall of its allies in northern Syria. The three factors that I think the government will use to bolster its position are, number one, support or stability of the single-party government at home, or the return to single-party government at home, rather. I think that's going to help the government forward its policies. Second, refugee crisis in Europe, especially in the aftermath of the Paris attacks, is going to find Turkey more allies, including in Paris, but also elsewhere, as Turkey tries to set up a safe haven, as unofficial as it is in northern Syria. More countries now are likely to support that idea, because that safe haven is not just a safe haven, it's also a buffer to prevent flow of further refugees into Europe from Syria, not just into Turkey, but into the European Union. And I think that's where Turkey now finds more eager allies than it did last year. And number three, I think Turkey will also leverage the evolution of U.S. policy on PYD to its own advantage. And what I mean by that is the following. For the last 2 years, we have seen the evolution of Washington's policy on PYD, which stands for Party for Democratic Unity, which is an associate of the PKK, which Turkey has been fighting, which is designated as a terrorist entity by both the United States and Turkey. And the United States has been working with PYD to push back against ISIS. And I think that policy has helped bring Turkey on board in Syria against ISIS more than any other U.S. attempt. Primarily when the PYD took over Tel Abyad, which is a town in northern Syria, which allowed the PYD to connect two Kurdish-controlled cantons, Kobani in the center with Jazeera in the east. Turkey's decision to enter the front against ISIS was triggered by that move, meaning when Turkey realized that the PYD was on the verge of getting control of entire northern Syria, connecting all three of its enclaves, therefore establishing a PYD/PKK cordon across Turkish territory, Turkey decided to come on board, and I think Washington is aware of this, but this has also helped evolve Washington's policy in Syria, as well as its Kurdish policy, that I think the United States at the end of the day has picked and will pick Turkey as its more long-term ally in Syria, being aware of the limited reach and capabilities of the Kurds in northern Syria. Here's what I mean by that. So the PYD is a fighting force. It has won victories against ISIS. They're great. But ultimately, that's a Kurdish group. If they were to take over, let's say, Raqqa, which is the unofficial capital of the Islamic State, they could take it over. But the next day, they would be occupiers, as Kurds occupying an Arab city. That would only boost support for ISIS, and everybody is aware of that. So I think with the knowledge that the PYD can do a good job in northern Syria, but that's pretty much it. If you need somebody to push back against ISIS, that will be not the Kurds. I think Washington's policy has evolved, and Ankara will take advantage of that to work closely with Washington as it tries to prevent the fall of Turkey-backed areas in northern Syria into the hands of the Assad regime. So that provides us, in finishing, Barry, I think, with two conclusions. One is that Turkey is going to remain forward in northern Syria, as it has been, supporting groups and providing assistance to those groups. But it will probably come down a notch because it really does not want to enter into a conflict with Russia, even if that looks like a proxy war. It will be the first time the Turks and the Russians have fought since 1878. That's a lot of old memory coming back. And at the same time, I think Turkey will also leverage the newfound need in European capitals to get Turkey as a serious ally to control the flow of refugees. The one takeaway of this rather gloomy conversation, since you asked me also to bring up the positive sides of it, is the silver lining of the cloud is this might actually help Turkey's EU accession process. The fact that Turkey is now in a stronger bargaining position vis-a-vis EU for the first time in over a decade. Earlier, Turkey was asking to enter the European Union, and it was kind of coming to the bargaining table from a position of weakness. Now it's coming to the table from a position of strength, because it can deliver assistance or not against the refugee crisis, and this is a huge crisis in Europe in the aftermath of the Paris attack. So I think it won't be surprising, for example, to see that European countries, France and others, will lift their objections to the opening of accession chapters, which were frozen because of French and Cypriot objections. And I think Cypriot objections, which have nothing to do with the French objections, will probably be lifted because France wants them to be lifted. So ultimately, I think this is a game changer in the long term for Turkish-EU talks. That's one positive takeaway for Turkey. But of course, it all depends on the international community's collective efforts to push back against ISIS. And I think I agree with the general that that really requires a multi-pronged effort, and not a single country can do it on their own. And I think Turkey's participation in this effort is significant. And I think in the aftermath of the Ankara attack, but now the Paris attack, we'll see more Turkish-US cooperation against ISIS than before. So I'll end here, and thank you.
Thanks very much, Soner. Let me turn next to Begüm, maybe, since Soner raised so many issues, in particular specific to Turkey. Begüm, do you think Russia's entry into the war will have these kinds of structural effects on Turkey's position? My own view is Russia's intervention is not without its own risks, like any other power that is drawn into this type of conflict. But in particular, how do you think Turkey's approach to the conflict right in its neighborhood might evolve, sort of in the near term?
So first of all, I would like to thank the Atlantic Council team for having me as a panelist here. I covered a similar session last year during last year's summit, so I'm standing in front of you as a panelist this time, so thank you for that. So as all of the panelists have already pointed out, the situation in the Middle East has gone from bad to worse, actually. So the problem is no longer limited to the Middle East. We have, newcomers, new players in the game right now, such as Russia. And the most pressing security threat is right now, the capability of ISIS to be able to strike Western capitals like we saw in Turkey's capital, Ankara, and the Paris attack as well. So against this background, let me touch upon a little bit the general security situation inside Syria right now. The U.S. coalition airstrikes have actually yielded mixed results. Like the terrorist organization's capability in, let's say, in Sinjar has been degraded, but with the Paris attack, the ISIS is trying to say that, okay, you can push me out of Sinjar, but I can still strike you in the heart of your capital. So we right now have the Russians in the game, and they are actually carrying out airstrikes stronger than the US coalition airstrikes now. So Turkey has actually begun to change its policy vis-a-vis Syria, as Soner Çağaptay has also touched upon. We're like, I think it's safe to say that Turkey has now backtracked on its demand that Assad should go. Even though we're still hearing, you know, when Turkish Foreign Minister Feridun Sinirlioğlu speaks about the talks in Vienna, he still says that, all right, Assad will not be a candidate in the elections in Syria. But I think that every country involved in the Vienna talks, in the Syrian process, will try to sell this roadmap, plan of action to their respective public, respective nation. So that's why I think we should not focus more on the discourse, but the action. So apart from that, we'll probably see Turkey's policy evolving in the near future, because I think that Feridun Sinirlioğlu's statement, he said that you will see Turkey will be involved in a much more stronger military action inside Syria. And a week later, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry spoke on CNN, and he said we're entering an operation with the Turks in northern Syria. So I think that those two statements are no coincidence. So in the near future, we will probably be seeing more cooperation between the United States and Turkey, even though President Obama has actually shut the door for the option of forming a secure zone, a safe zone inside Syria. I think that we might be heading towards that in the near future. So I'm not going to be getting into the refugee crisis. I think we will have time to touch on this more, right, Barry?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Soner. You also raised some very important issues that we should continue to address. And now, last but not least, Fred Hoff. Fred, can you give us your thoughts on these issues?
Sure, Barry. Thanks very much. I'll be very brief, and I'll just highlight a couple of things. Really, as Barry mentioned, for the past almost 3 years now, I've been focusing pretty much exclusively on Syria at the Atlantic Council in the Rafik Hariri Center. One quick commercial. We have a new blog called Syria Source, and for those of you who are interested really in checking in on the Syria problem periodically, it's really nice. Not so much because of the stuff I write in there. We are really tapping into some very, very important civil society figures trying to operate inside Syria. And this is really a niche that I think nobody else is filling. So Syria Source, check it out. In recent days, recent weeks, I've really been focusing on two Syria-related issues in particular. One is this new Vienna diplomatic process, an attempt to configure some kind of a political diplomatic solution to the Western Syria situation, if you will, the Assad side of the problem. And the second is the response, or perhaps lack thereof, to what happened in Paris Friday night. On the Vienna process, very briefly, what I would suggest you take a close look at in the coming days and weeks is what specifically is done to protect Syrian civilians from the ongoing deliberate targeting of the Assad regime, whether by barrel bombs, artillery shells, gravity bombs, Scud missiles, rockets. This is the key issue. The most recent issue on Saturday, the most recent meeting on Saturday, issued a homework assignment. Without naming names, it said that those who have influence on this problem should use their influence to stop it. All right? This is code for Russia and Iran getting their client out of this dirty business. For those of you who may not be moved by the humanitarian imperative here, there's a very important political diplomatic aspect to it. And that is, as long as civilians are on the bullseye in Syria, there is no prospect for dialogue or negotiation. This process is doomed if civilians remain on the bullseye. How, after all, do you get an opposition team at this point to negotiate as their constituents are being either blown away or put on the long march to northwestern Europe? Keep an eye on this subject. Will the Russians and Iranians actually go to Bashar and tell him to knock it off? If they do, and if it sticks, then they've probably got the power to go to Bashar and tell him, all right, next thing you're going to do is negotiate seriously with the opposition. They did not do this a year ago in the context of Geneva, so the process there was, to say the least, not satisfactory. On the response to Paris, I'm not going to try to compete with General Jones in describing the military need for a competent, capable ground combat element to close with and kill ISIS on the ground. I think the place to start is in Syria, where this organization has its headquarters, has its logistical lines of communications into Iraq, and has no real deep roots in the Syrian population. What I can say at this point, based on President Obama's comments at a recent press conference, I believe in Ankara, is that his appetite for putting together an international coalition, perhaps regional powers, perhaps some Western European powers, to put together the requisite ground component, that appetite is very much under control. The president rejected the idea of putting 50,000 Americans on the ground in Syria. I think that rejection was proper. Nobody, in fact, has made that proposal. He also said that ISIS is not susceptible to routine military tactics. To be very honest with you, I don't know what that means. We are conducting air assaults. We are working with local militias. And on the other side of the boundary, we're training an Iraqi army. So I think ISIS would, in fact, be susceptible to being closed with by a capable, conventional ground force. For the United States to go down this path, it's going to be a major, heavy diplomatic lift. And there will have to be A, skin in the game on the ground in Syria beyond 50 special operators, and B, a convincing argument by the United States that it is in for the duration, for as long as it takes to defeat ISIS in Syria. So I think the combination of civilian protection in Western Syria, beating ISIS, beating it militarily in Eastern Syria, I think these are the key principles we ought to be aiming at. But it's not yet clear whether the parties, starting with the United States, are really going to come to grips with this.
Fred, let me just ask a quick follow-up, because you have such a clear set of views on Syria. I'm not sure I heard your views on Assad's role either now or in a transition or after a transition, number one. Then I want to turn to the panel on Iran. I mean, it's not we haven't really talked about it much, and I think it's a pretty structural shift in regional dynamics, or at least a significant shift. And then I want to turn back to strategy for the region broadly. But first, Fred, did I hear you address Assad?
Sure. Very briefly on the question of Assad. When I was in the State Department, I was part of the negotiating team that put together the Geneva final communique of June 30th, 2012. Much of this debate over the role of Bashar al-Assad in a transition is covered by this Geneva blueprint, which has been reaffirmed by the Vienna Group. There is to be a negotiation to create a transitional governing body that would exercise full executive power. This negotiation would proceed under the principle of mutual consent between the parties, which means if the opposition delegation consents to a continuing role for Bashar al-Assad in the governing of Syria, Bashar al-Assad will execute that role. If the opposition does not consent to it, he will not. That is the Geneva formula. I think a lot of the talk, frankly, about whether Assad should go or stay is extraneous. I think when the opposition approaches this, they'll look at it from the point of view of, given the past 4.5 years, is Bashar al-Assad somebody who can inspire even-handed confidence? Is he someone who will protect civilians under the rule of law? Is he somebody who can put Syria on the path to reconciliation, reform, and reconstruction? If they come to that conclusion, then they may well decide that there's a role for Bashar.
Thanks, Fred. And then I just wanted to throw to the panel the question of Iran, and I think it's at least a two-part question. One is, there's the nuclear agreement, and how do you see that playing out as it moves toward being executed and implemented? There are some milestones. But in general, how do you see that playing out, and what do you see its effects on regional security? But then secondly, there's all the other Iran-related issues that come up, its activities, its relationship with Hezbollah, its work, its efforts in Syria and other places. Sort of what's the Iran factor in this discussion?
Well, I certainly don't think we're seeing a cooperative role from Iran. After the nuclear deal, which obviously we've entered into with other sovereign nations, but Iran's behavior has certainly not changed, and they're still negatively playing a role in Syria and Lebanon and Yemen. In the Middle East peace process itself, still chanting "Death to America" and in the streets, and so I don't know how you gather any kind of confidence from that kind of behavior, and I think the question is still an open question as to whether, regardless of what they choose to do in the nuclear agreement, I don't think too many of the Gulf states, even though they've acquiesced to the agreement privately, I think they express very negative views about the potential of success here. But unless and until Iran changes its behavior overall with regard to the region and its destabilization policies, I don't know how you can get away from feeling that Iran is going to continue to play a very negative role in every way it can. And I think the Russian presence is a complicating factor. Things that we could have done 2 or 3 years ago are more difficult to do now. We'll have to wait and see what Mr. Putin's ambition is. If he chooses to form some sort of an alliance with Iraq and Iran, when Iran is obviously very influential in Iraq, and Syria, then you have another kind of resurrection, a different type of Cold War structure that manifests itself in the Middle East. So these are all this is all part of the broader discussion that things since 2014 have gotten much worse.
Also just wanted to weigh in on Iran. I think that because we oftentimes think of Iran as an Islamic republic, we forget the fact that it's actually an hegemonic power, and perhaps the only truly hegemonic power in the Middle East, in the sense that it has proxies and it tries to spread its influence or shape the region after its own image. And I think this is not necessarily a function of Iran's Islamic Republic nature. I think Iran has been an hegemonic state. It has a deep imperial memory. It's the only state in the region that has a live imperial memory. I think Turkey thinks it does, but that imperial memory is mostly invented by the current government. That's why it has failed, or it's imagined rather, not invented. And I think that's why it's not succeeded. Iran's imperial memory is more alive, it's more unbroken. And I think the Shah's imprint has really been passed on to the Islamic Republic's elites as well. I think if Iran is a liberal democracy tomorrow, it will spread liberal democracy. It's not to say that being hegemonic is necessarily bad. It's just that it's an anti-systemic hegemonic power. It wants to spread its influence, but it does so through anti-systemic means. It has terrorist groups. You know, it used assassination. It has proxies. It seeds discord in the regional states. And I think its hegemonic nature is really not confined to the religious nature of its government. And here's what I mean by that. So Iran is Shiite, its government is Shiite. So if it's hegemonic, you would expect Iran's hegemonic outreach to be mostly Shiite, which is sometimes the case, but not necessarily. In Lebanon, Iran supports the Shiites. There is Hezbollah. In the Palestinian theater, it's Sunni Hamas. In the southern Caucasus, you would expect Iran's proxy to be Shiite Azerbaijan. That's not the case. It's Christian Armenia. So I think it's an incredibly imperial power, in the sense that it works with any ally and any proxy it can get in the region to shape the region in its own image. And its presence in Syria, of course, is in relationship to that, because it really doesn't want to lose influence in Syria, because the end of the Assad regime in Syria would mean that Iran would exit the Eastern Mediterranean. It would no more be a power with access to that region. It would no more have access to Hezbollah or through Syria, and I think that's why it has huge stakes in that region and doesn't want to let that go.
Thanks much, Soner. Any other thoughts on Iran? Fred Hopp.
Just very quickly, I can report a couple of things from Track 2 discussions I've had over the past 2.5 years with Iranians who I've grown to respect quite deeply. Just two things about Syria. Number one, there is a degree of real unease with the worst aspects of their clients' behavior. One of my Iranian interlocutors told me, he said, "Fred, you got to understand, we don't like Bashar al-Assad. We've got no respect for Bashar al-Assad. If we weren't there, imagine what these Arabs would be doing to one another." The second thing, though, is, if the same people are saying Syria is extraordinarily important to Iran in a national security sense, particularly in the sense of for 14 years, Bashar al-Assad has demonstrated his willingness to do what Iran wants with respect to Hezbollah next door. And whether Iranians process this as our thumb of pressure on Israel or our deterrent capability against Israel, from an Iranian perspective, it's extremely important. Bashar is essential. If Bashar goes, this is their analysis, the regime collapses, and there is no such thing as an adequate substitute for Bashar al-Assad in this particular context.
Thanks, Fred. I think we want to turn to the audience soon, but I want to ask the panel perhaps the hardest question, or at least to give us some thoughts on the hardest question, which is, what are the elements of an approach, of a strategy to lift us out of this real, really terrible confluence of negative security trends, and that seem to keep getting worse by the month? What can you give us just even some considerations for thinking about how do we work to stop the free fall and start to change the trajectory of this region? Obviously working closely with countries and officials and leaders and civil society, wherever it may exist, in the region. This isn't something that's going to be imposed from the outside, but any thoughts on sort of not just responses to today's developments, but how do we start to move towards a more sustainable proposition?
Well, as an American, I can say that I think that the United States has to overcome the perception of disengagement in the Middle East, whether it's real or imagined. It is what it is. And as I said, the thing that troubles me a little bit is there's obviously a disconnect in capitals as to what the intentions are and what are the words that are translating back and forth, and that is, to me, the starting point. The so-called pivot towards Asia, now called rebalance towards Asia, sent really negative impressions throughout the Gulf. I think we've come to the point now where if you really want to eliminate the first threat, which is ISIS, I think serious-minded people know what has to be done, and you have to form the coalition that is necessary to do that. It doesn't have to be an American-only type of response. It can be part of NATO. It could be NATO. It could be NATO and the Arab world working together. But there is a solution to ISIS, and to try to make this a mountain that's 5 miles high is ridiculous. This is a terrorist bunch of murderous thugs that are occupying a significant portion of a couple of countries. They've established state-like behavior in terms of how they're financed and using oil and everything else. And it can be cut. It can be done. And it's not going to take 5 years. It's not going to take 3 years. But it has to be done. So until we show that kind of resolve collectively, and I think my country should be at the forefront of forming this type of coalition. And as much as we're all tired of fighting and tired of Afghanistan and Iraq, you have to start with the wolf that's closest to the door, and that's ISIS. And then you take on the next thing and then the next thing. But unless and until you're willing to show that resolve of trying to appease dictators has never been historically a good strategy or one that's been successful.
Thank you, General. Any other thoughts on, as I said, a strategy or a longer-term perspective? I mean, I worry that a military coalition alone won't dry up the root causes of this.
I mean, as I said earlier, the military aspect, we've gone beyond the point where you can negotiate this thing, I think. But we, the developed world and the coalition, including the Arabs, like-minded Arab states, should also give hope to the people of the region that there is an economic recovery, there is governance and rule of law, that they're not going to be threatened with assassinations day and night. And so it's a package. In my view, the formula is security plus economic development and governance and rule of law is the path to security. And those 3 legs of that stool have to be applied in rough proportions so you can be successful.
Thanks, General Jones. Any other thoughts on this before I turn to the audience's solutions? Fred.
Just very quick. I think the long-term goal here is legitimate governance in the region. And if we're talking specifically about ISIS, it's legitimate governance in Syria and Iraq, because it has been illegitimacy in both places that's created the vacuum that ISIS has filled. And this organization is the ultimate vacuum filler. The Middle East Strategy Task Force that Barry alluded to, headed by Madeleine Albright and Steve Hadley, this is the core of what they are looking into and trying to form a long-term strategy for the region. So I would urge you to pay attention to this, because I think they're going to be coming up with some very important findings.
And that'll be discussed during this summit. Soner?
Also, short-term and mid-term solutions, I think one goes through looking at the regional dynamics and realizing that 5 years ago, there were about half a dozen police states in the Middle East. Now we have about half a dozen failed states. And the challenge of the failed states is that they breed extremism, and Al-Qaeda has used them to morph into ISIS. But I think that's a story that has also got to do with the brutality of the Assad regime in the Syrian war. So long as, I agree with Fred here, so long as the civilians are in harm's way, they will continue to radicalize towards Al-Qaeda, because that's the only group that comes out and helps them to prevent them from getting slaughtered by what Assad is doing. So if Assad is in the picture, there's no way you can prevent further radicalization, because that legacy will at least be around, or unless you stop his violence immediately. And I think a short-term fix for the U.S. administration and others is to prevent the failed states from pulling their neighbors in and making them into failed states. So that's Jordan at risk, that's Lebanon at risk, that's Turkey at risk, and countries of the Gulf, not the Gulf, but of the Levant in general, including Egypt, which has a problem now in the Sinai. And I think that's really where U.S. interests are. Three of America's key allies, Jordan, Israel, Turkey, border these weak states, and they risk being pulled into their risk, as we saw in Turkey this summer. That's a very real risk that these countries pose. In the midterm, I think that the efforts against ISIS have to be military. There has got to be a military component, which includes not only U.S. and its NATO allies, but also like-minded Arab states. But ultimately, this really goes into fixing Iraq and not fixing Syria. I think ISIS is a phenomenon, started Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That is, it started in Iraq, it got pushed into Syria, it went back into Iraq, it came back into Syria. So you can fix it in one country, but if you don't fix it in both countries, it will keep going back and forth, using the vacuum of ungoverned space or weak state in one area to come back into the other, and given the porous nature of this very long border between the two countries. So I think the approach to ISIS requires a Levant-wide or Fertile Crescent-wide strategy that spans Iraq, Syria alike, and targets the group's presence in both places, not just one or the other specifically.
Can I make a small contribution? There is a perception in people's mind that, engagement by the United States in the region didn't work, and it is obvious right now that disengagement also didn't work. So, so ISIS is a big army with an ideology which is actually running a good PR business as well. They have been recruiting a lot of people who have maybe lost hope. So I think just a small note for the Muslim authorities maybe, because it's not enough just to say that, all right, ISIS does not represent Islam or a Muslim community. So I think the Muslim authorities have to come together and really discuss what should be done in order to eradicate the ISIS ideology or everything that it represents. So this is something that we saw with the Paris attacks as well. So it actually relieves me on one hand to hear leaders saying, all right, we have to make a distinction between the refugees and those terrorists. I am relieved on this side, but I am also concerned. That those type of attacks will lead to the rise of the far-right movements in Europe as well. So that's one of the big challenges that we face right now. And Muslim leaders have to come together and do something about this. And also, political leaders also should come to understand that, this is an ideology and we have to fight against this together.
Thanks very much. And now we'll turn to the audience. All very good suggestions, some of them very, very difficult, including the question of establishing legitimate governance, but I think that's exactly right. The only addition I'd add as a moderator with a comment is to deal with ISIS effectively, we need to go into the cyber domain. We need to, as the most recent Foreign Affairs piece said, launch a digital counterinsurgency, because if we do everything physically but don't do it also on the internet, in social media, we will fail, because that's one of their key sources of power. I think I had a first question over there. And if you could identify yourself, wait for the microphone, and make them real questions, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Yarjani. I'm from Iran, not representative of the Iranian government. I heard so many times about Iran, but you're not asking me only questions. So the question will be why there is no representative from Iran to counter some of the points that were made here. And if you give me the opportunity, in 2 minutes or 3 minutes, I can have a comment about the many points which was raised here.
Please do, I think.
I think ISIS now is the existential problem, not Iran. And the best thing will be to look at how ISIS was created. We have to go back to the history. And if we go back to the history, we'll see how Al-Qaeda was created. So I think some of the points, very important points, were made by some of the gentlemen and the lady, the ideology. We have to see how this ideology is coming about, where it started, who's feeding it, those charities which are sending the money in billions and millions, so they are the source of the problem. So I agree with some of the points were made here, that we have to confront ISIS with the force in the short term. In the midterm and long term, we have to go to the core of the problem. Why this belief of the hatred comes to the existence? Who is feeding it? I believe ISIS is a cancer. In order to fight the cancer, you have to stop feeding the corrupt cells. These corrupt cells are fed by the ideology. So you have to stop those madrasa which make proud that they are creating #1 suicide bombers. They have done it. I have read it in the Western media. So you have to, go to them. And also stopping those charities, so-called charities, which feed these. Secondly, you have to stop their economic lifeline. U.S., with the best technology, has no problem in heating those tankers which are carrying the oil for the ISIS. They can do it in no time. But you said the boot on the ground, fine. We have seen it, what happened in the Iraq. But when the ISIS were moving to the Baghdad and Erbil, when the United States was thinking if they want to stop it, who were there first? Ask Mr. Barzani, who is not a very good friend of Iran, but he agreed it was Iranians for the first time stopping them to go to Erbil. Ask the Iraqis. If Iran was not there, today we have to talk about how to kick ISIS out of the Baghdad. So I think, to be fair, we have to go to the core of the problem. And I hope, for the next year, maybe hopefully Iranians will be represented here. I'm just giving my view as a citizen, but I believe, someone said Iran is the core of the problem. If Iran is the core of the problem, why for the first time it is invited to be in the Vienna? Because in the Geneva, they understood they have to represent all the countries involved, which can have influence. Iran was very open, critical to Bashar al-Assad for the treating its, the demonstration. But for the demonstration, treating like Bashar al-Assad, which is common in the Middle East, look at the other countries. Is it real to let all the terrorists to do what they are doing today and only blaming Bashar al-Assad, which we have no love for it? But at least, Iran, the #1 country, which said Iran is an existential problem, was Saddam Hussein. He invaded Iran 8 years, got the support from all the countries in the region. Iranian people and the Kurdish people were gassed, And it was later on was proved that intelligence was given by the American, airplanes. So I'm sorry for taking this, but because many of the comments were made against Iran, and I hope the next year to be a balance, we can have someone from Iranian government as well. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you very much for your comments. Does anyone on the panel have any responses to that, or shall we move to the next audience intervention? I think that this gentleman in the front was the next question. Excuse me? I think I can handle the order of the questions. This gentleman and then Barbara.
Glenmore, Trenia Harvey. There is an elephant in the room, it seems to me, and that is Saudi. I haven't heard any mention of Saudi, and I particularly would like the view of anyone on the panel in terms of the new regime in Saudi, and what impact do you think that will have in terms of Syria?
Thank you. Excellent question. We have a lot of flux in Saudi Arabia, a new leadership team. They're involved in a significant military operation with some of their Gulf partners. We have the energy equation also relevant. I think this is a very important question for the future of the region. Any comments from the panel?
The Saudis will actually be another one of the homework assignments from Vienna was Stefan de Mistura, the special envoy of the UN, was supposed to gather the various elements of the opposition together to mold them into a single team and help them arrive at a common agenda, perhaps the ultimate exercise in herding cats. The Saudis will be convening a meeting. I'm not sure of the exact date in Iran to try to expedite that process, at least with the groups that they have some influence with. So I think that's probably the most current manifestation of their activity in Syria.
Barbara Slavin, who was third on my list.
Thanks, Barry. I'm Barbara Slavin. I manage an Iran task force at the Atlantic Council. I wanted to commend the gentleman from Iran and let him know that we actually did invite representatives of the Iranian government, and unfortunately they declined. I would very much have liked their voice on this panel in particular. To my friend Soner, yes, hegemonic Iran, Iran would not be the power that it is in Iraq if the United States had not eliminated the regime of Saddam Hussein. And most likely we would not have ISIS to face either if the U.S. had not invaded in 2003. My question is to Fred Hoff. You mentioned herding cats. Is there a coherent opposition for Syria that can be put forward that will be in a position to actually negotiate with the Assad regime? And what could be the role of Russia and Iran in helping to move toward a political transition? If we simply demonize them as the Gulf states have done, how are we going to get there? Thank you.
The Syrian opposition did, in the case of Geneva I, at the end of 2013, beginning of 2014, put together a coherent team with a coherent agenda that actually attempted to negotiate. How representative that team was of everybody in Syria that's opposed to Bashar al-Assad, that's very difficult to say. The situation in Syria doesn't really lend itself to a great many scientific calculations in that respect. The problem at Geneva I, at Montreux and Geneva, was that the Russians were unable to deliver a regime team that was willing to negotiate. The position of the Syrian Arab Republic government is that it rejects the Geneva final communique of June 30th, 2012. For the Russians to really pull their weight in this Vienna conference, they, perhaps with the assistance of Iran, need to change that Syrian government position and deliver them. This will be an enormously complicated and difficult task, trying to put together a representative opposition negotiating team. Clearly, some of the armed groups have to be represented. The current coalition leader, who is located here in Istanbul, Khalid Hoxha, has reached out to these armed groups to try to organize them. I think, Barbara, it's easy to heap contempt on the Syrian opposition, but let's bear in mind who the authors of mass homicide are in Syria. Let's keep in mind that for Syrian people that's been who have been subjected really to a very, very, very authoritarian system for the last several decades, it's not easy to awaken from an enforced political coma and operate in a spirit of teamwork and compromise. It's a work in progress. I think we should show more patience with them and less patience with those who are practicing collective punishment and mass homicide.
Respond to these comments on Iran. Barbara, I agree with you. Iran is hegemonic, and U.S. invasion of Iraq has complicated the region, allowed Iran space to move around more freely. But Iran was hegemonic even before the U.S. invasion of Iraq. It had proxies, Hamas in the Palestinian theater, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Kurds in Iraq, and influence in other countries as well. So I think it's Iran's policy that is timeless. All countries are hegemonic, and my criticism is not that Iran is hegemonic, with all due respect. I think every country wants to shape its neighbors and its region, but the question is, how do you get there? Do you sell soap operas? Do you use your airline? Do you use your companies? Or do you do truck bombs? It's an anti-systemic hegemonic power, which is where it's problematic. So it's not that it's hegemonic, that's not a criticism of Iran, but it's the methods with which it wields influence. And the point I wanted to make is that we oftentimes forget that this hegemonic drive is not really religious, it's imperial and historical, because Iran does use non-Shiite, even non-Muslim proxies when it wants to. And as I said, it's because it's truly one of the few countries in the region imprinted with a deep historical memory of being an empire, and it carries it into the present time, and it makes things complicated for others, because being anti-systemic, it uses violence, terror groups, proxies, and others, which I think wreak havoc in the region. And a lot of Syria's mess can be explained through the initial support Iran gave to the Assad government, which helped them brutalize civilian populations, which drove them to al-Qaeda. It did not create al-Qaeda, it drove them to al-Qaeda. In 2010-11, beginning of the Syrian war, I had journalist friends who crossed into Syria from Turkey. I would ask them and I would say, what percentage are jihadists? They would say 3 to 5% of the rebels were jihadists. In 2012, I said, what percentage? They said 10. In 2013, I said, what percentage? They said 50. Today, it's overwhelming. And I think we got here because the Assad regime brutalized civilian populations. Iran helped that brutalization. So they did not create al-Qaeda. They did not create its ideology, but they pushed populations by carrying out mass homicide and atrocities. And I think it's that civilian suffering that will keep driving people towards radical groups, which has to stop if you want to fix the ISIS problem at the root.
Thanks very much, Soner. And we have a question from Eunice over here. Please.
Hi, I'm Naseba Yunus, and I lead the Iraq work at the Atlantic Council. I wanted to ask General Jones, based on his experience working with the Obama White House, how prepared is the White House in this administration to get involved in the nitty-gritty of the political negotiations that need to take place on the ground in Iraq and in Syria? Just by way of example, we've recently seen the fall of Sinjar in an operation that happened far faster and much more easily than many analysts predicted, which raises the question of why it took so long for the PKK and the KDP to come to an agreement to launch that attack. Why has the US not been more forthcoming in brokering that negotiation? And also, we're seeing violence breaking out between the Kurdish Peshmerga forces and Iraqi Shiite militias in the town of Tuz-Hormato. And this is a very, very worrying harbinger of potential future outbreaks of conflict. And lastly, Prime Minister Abadi is under extreme pressure from Shiite political rivals on the hard line. How far is the US prepared to go in preventing his ouster, which could really spell a very dangerous end to our entire political strategy in Iraq?
You're not helping my headache.
Oh my God.
And now you know why I'm in the private sector. Look, those are all excellent questions, and I subscribe to the theory that virtual presence is actual absence, and the United States cannot be disengaged from from the region. I think leadership counts. I think the United States still counts, but I openly hear in the different parts of the region about American decline or American disengagement. When you're a superpower and you disengage from somewhere or give the appearance you are, creates a vacuum. Vacuums are filled by people that don't subscribe to your values, and I think this is what happens. This problem will not be solved by military force alone, even though I've said I think we're at the point where we really need to reconsider our options. Libya was a good example of a bombing campaign that flattened the country and left it in complete disarray. The red lines, the weakness of the red line policy in Syria is probably another inflection point where things could have been done that might have precluded almost 1 million people from seeking refuge in Europe. So it's very, very complicated questions. And disengagement, or the perception of disengagement, is not going to help this, is not going to resolve this. I think that your question was to what extent do we think that the administration will change course and do something about it? I'm not optimistic.
Well, let me stick to this question for a little bit longer, and would love to hear from our Turkish friends about the question of U.S. engagement going forward. And then I want to return to General Jones briefly and ask about there is this presidential election in the United States, and I'm sure everyone's eager to hear at least your thoughts on that. But maybe first, Soner and Begüm, any thoughts on this question of sort of the relative U.S. engagement?
I can't necessarily give you a Turkish view, but I can, since I'm based in Washington, I can give you the U.S. view of how Turkey sees the changing dynamics on the Syrian landscape. I would say that Washington is both saddened and relieved by the outcome of the recent elections. Saddened because it's a return to some of the problematic patterns of democracy and governance, but relieved because you have a single-party government, political stability, and predictability of decision-making once again. And I think that relief is basically that now you have a strong government with strong popular mandate, a vast majority in the parliament that can help the United States and that doesn't have to worry about public opposition to its policies. But the problem, of course, is that recent polls shows that there is widespread discontent with the government's Syria policy, except for support for actions against ISIS. So in this regard, the U.S. is actually well positioned. There's broader support to Turkish government helping America fight ISIS than Turkish government getting involved in any other place in Syria against any other actor. And I think I agree with the general. I don't think the White House will change its mind in terms of troop deployments, troops on the ground in Syria before the end of the term of President Obama. So that really limits us to fewer options or smaller options of what can be done. I think what is really important is right now, very immediate, is the securing of the border, the Turkish-Syrian border. This is a very long border which has been porous for a rather long time. And this is not just political. I think the Turkish movie industry and literature is full of works about smugglers who made their living on the Turkish-Syrian border in the 60s and 30s and 19th century. So this is a very long tradition. I think that border has been penetrated for a very long time. How many of you have been to it, actually, Turkish-Syrian border, or seen it? It's incredibly flat. There are no physical barriers, mountains, lakes, rivers. It runs for 540 miles. So the priority is to seal that border, and I think there's now only a small area of that border still controlled by ISIS, about 60 miles long, and I think the immediate priority is really that area. So I would see Turkish-U.S. action along that area to clean that from ISIS presence, which would then effectively seal ISIS inside Syria for the first time. And it would open the path for breaking it up into pieces then. When you take highways and strategic points, the taking of Sinjar is actually breaking ISIS Mosul from ISIS Raqqa, successful. And you could expect similar operations to break ISIS cities from one another, and the idea is then that it would implode because its recruitment efforts and its smuggling efforts, which provided with financial flow of income, would both be halted, and that would facilitate the implosion of that group gradually.
So Turkey has finally come out of the election cycle, which means that one good result of the election is that Turkey has now a functioning government and will have a new cabinet, which will be able to, at least which will try to tackle the issues that have been frozen for some time. So that's one point. But I think that I agree with General Jim Jones that the Obama administration is and will be unwilling to change its position vis-a-vis the Syrian crisis. But I am trying to understand, maybe a question from one panelist to the other. I wonder why we are hearing mixed signals and mixed statements from the Obama administration vis-a-vis a safe zone inside Syria. Like, President Obama, shuts the door to the options, including a no-fly zone and a safe zone, whereas Secretary of State Kerry mentions that the Turks and the Americans are entering an operation inside Syria. So I'm just, curious how we should also read those conflicting statements coming from the same administration.
Thank you very much. I have three questions I know of, at least in the audience, which we'll do very quickly, but I want to hear from General Jones on both the question of the U.S. presidential election. People are watching what's going on in the U.S. and they must be wondering, what the heck is going on there. But secondly, I think this excellent question from Begüm about the Obama administration's view on safe zones, and Fred might chime in too, and then we'll hit the question.
I'm really the wrong guy to ask a question about politics. I'm as apolitical as the next guy. I don't know what's going to happen.
In particular, about what the impact is on the U.S. role in the Middle East.
Well, I think it's very important. I think our stature in the world is a country that does the right thing. You can't bring yourself to do what you know is fundamentally right or moral, then you lose the mantle of leadership. And I think we're flirting with that in this region. I think regional conflicts require regional solutions, and that includes things beyond simple military intervention. Number two, I would say that whatever coalitions exist in the world, these coalitions had better become more proactive and less reactive, because if you don't become more proactive to prevent future conflicts, you're going to have more of the same for the rest of the century. For example, I'm a little stunned that NATO so far, at least nobody has invoked Article 5 in NATO. An attack against one is an attack against all. They did it on 9/11 for the United States. What's different here? And why isn't the French president why isn't somebody asking for at least an emergency meeting of the North Atlantic Council to discuss this issue. 28 sovereign countries, plus like-minded friends and allies in the region should be able to kind of come to grips with saying enough. This is a moral issue of the highest order. When you look at these people being stampeded all over the continent, and everybody's kind of sitting back and talking about it, but really not doing very much about it. I think it's outrageous.
Thank you. We're going to take a couple of questions in a row. So if everybody can be brief and to the point, I'll collect one or two questions, maybe three for the audience, from the audience.
Hello. Good evening, Lorne Thiessen. May I just say that I actually lived in Lebanon for 10 years, and I know Syria quite well. And I agree with everything that the General Jones said and part of your analysis. On the issue of existential threats, I think it's quite clear that ISIS represent the wolf at the door. And my concern is that these horrible events in tragedy in Paris is just the beginning. And it's the beginning simply because there has been no effective Western coherent policy in Syria for the last 5 years. And I have a question for General Jones, which is that there is a view that's, that I've heard in London, which is that Putin's involvement doesn't look like a proper commitment to a long military campaign. There aren't Russian infantry in Syria. There aren't Iranian Pasdaran in Syria. And if we all agree that somebody has to take the fight to ISIS, it doesn't seem obvious who's going to do that. And may I just add that one of the reasons why this is perceived to be the case is because events in the Middle East are decided on the battlefield, not with respect to the conference table. And if Putin had a serious campaign in mind, why would he open diplomatic channels so quickly and trying to bring the parties together? Thank you.
Interesting question. I think we had another one in this area. Yes, it was over there, sorry. And then one more, and then we'll go to the panel. Right over there, sorry.
Martin Wilhelm, Geopolis Energy. I'd be curious to hear what the panel's view is on the role of the Europeans in this crisis. Obviously, the refugee influx we've seen has turned into probably an existential challenge to the European Union. Part of the reason for that is it builds on the fragilities of the previous crisis that is not even over yet, the Euro crisis. And so it's at the same time, at least in Germany, I can say part of the feeling is that this is coming from a region where we have absolutely no engagement and ways of influencing things. So what's your view on that? And on the other hand, does the threat to the European Union from nationalist politics that are being fed by this, does that play any role in the American view on how far to engage in this? Because Europe, I think, is important.
Thank you very much.
American friends.
This gentleman here. And I'm going to pick up one more, and then promise I'll end there.
Thank you very much. I just have two short questions. One of them is a little general for the panel. What have we learned in Iraq with the military intervention in Iraq that's going to help us streamline what's going to happen in Syria? My second question is for Soner Bey. You talked about an indirect positive effect on Turkey because of the refugee discussions with EU. Would that bring EU and Turkey closer to each other? In your view, when the Europeans say, here's $3 billion, but keep the 2.5 million Syrians inside Turkey, that's what it is. This could be realpolitik you might say, but I have a lot of concerns about something like this being ethical or even human.
Thank you. And then one more question over here, please. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Judith Pasarelli from Pittsburgh Partners in New York. I wanted to follow up on your question about the refugees. I see that we mention them all the time as a potential threat. I don't understand why we don't mention them as a potential ally in this whole fight. They have experience fighting Assad or ISIS or both. They have an understanding of the situation on the ground, which we clearly have totally lost. Just following up on this previous question, we have major intelligence gaps. And now we have all these people who we can offer them protection right now, so we can actually offer them something in exchange for their help. We might actually want to, if we send soldiers to boots on the ground to one of these countries, we might actually ask them to join us. And now we can train them, and it's not going to be 50 US Special Forces trying to hunt down the, remaining 12 moderates in Syria. So, I mean, seriously. So, I would just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. So we have 4 questions. We can take them in any order. I know one was directed at Soner. Soner, do you want to address them? And this is also a time to wrap up.
Absolutely. I'll be happy to. Look, I think Russia's deployment is with the knowledge that the Assad government will not be able to take all of Syria back. That's why it's not full-fledged. It's not all about long-term. Before the Russians deployed, it was becoming clear that the Assad regime was unraveling. He was about to pull out of some cities. He was saying maybe he wouldn't be able to hold on to Hama and Homs. And the Russian deployment helped him reinforce his possessions and push back a little bit. So it's really kind of, I think, created a more quote-unquote balanced theater in terms of the fighting. And my sense is that Putin's ultimate goal in Syria is not that he wishes Assad to take all of Syria back, but he wishes to get Syria close to what happened in Bosnia at the Dayton Agreement. In Bosnia, there was 4 years of civil war, very different than today, but there were proxies as well, but there was some foreign involvement, the Serb government and others, nowhere near what we saw in Syria. Syria has been, to me, it looks more like the Spanish Civil War in terms of involvement of international actors and the fight of ideologies. And so even with that scale, I think the Russian game, Putin's ultimate calculus is that all sides fighting in Syria will become sick and tired of fighting. And they will want to come to the negotiating table, which is what happened in Bosnia. And when that happens, you will have some sort of a ceasefire line in which the government of Syria will continue to hold on to some territories and the rebels will continue to hold on to some other territories. And Syria will become a dysfunctional state, in name unified, but in practice composed of multiple dysfunctional entities. I think that's the best case scenario that will come out of it. The worst case is that it becomes a failed state, Afghanistan, Somalia, and creates incredible amount of instability because of it's poorly governed and is also a breeding ground for Al-Qaeda and radicals. Europe's role and in the conflict, look, I think European policy has been so far focused on managing one crisis after the other. It went from Brexit to Ukraine to refugees, but you can't do 2 crises at a time. So Europe is now really worried about pushing the can down the road in terms of managing the refugee crisis, and which increases Turkey's value because Turkey is able to help Europe stem the flow of refugees. I agree with Begüm on Europe that I think one concern I share is that the European reaction to the Paris attack is going to be exactly what ISIS wants. Mistreatment of Muslims in Europe, further radicalization, which is really what ISIS is after, in my view. And unfortunately, not all of them, but a number of European countries have a record, at least in the 20th century, of doing extremes, either going far right or far left, but not really staying close to the center. So I hope that they stay close to the center in terms of reacting to the ISIS threat and the way they're dealing with their own Muslim communities, as well as the issue of immigration. Finally, on Turkey's EU accession, since that was a direct question to me, so in the short term, yes, I think there is a Faustian deal. That the deal is that Turkey will agree to keep the refugees because Turkey is not considered a readmission country, meaning refugees who cross illegally into Greece and Bulgaria or other EU countries cannot be sent back to Turkey. So that means that the flow continues. So if Turkey agreed to be a readmission country, that it can process refugees and they stay in Turkey, I think the Faustian deal is not monetary, but it is that Turkey would get visa-free travel for its own citizens. So the bottom line is that Syrians stay in Turkey and Turks go to Europe. That's the short-term deal. But the long-term deal, I think, is where the silver lining in the cloud is, and it will come because part of the deal is going to be lifting of European objections to accession talks. Accession talks between Turkey are now entirely frozen. Everybody knows the joke about trains in the Soviet Union? So let me tell this in finishing. We need a joke at the end of the day. So the joke is that during the Lenin years, the party and Lenin sat on the train, the people got off the train, they pushed the train, and the train moved. During the Stalin years, Stalin sat on the train, the party and the people got off the train, they pushed the train moved, Stalin was happy. During the Brezhnev years, Brezhnev sat on the train, the party and the people got on the train, everybody sat on the train did not move, the scenery did not change, and the people said choo-choo. That's Turkey's EU accession process right now. It's Brezhnev's train. It's been like this for about 5 years. No chapters have been opened or closed. Everybody's acting as if we have talks. The train will move again. That's why it's significant. It will move again. Objections to chapters will be lifted. That doesn't mean Turkey will get into the EU tomorrow, but I think it's positive because that actually makes EU an anchor of Turkey's democratic liberalization once again, which it has not been for over 10 years. So that's a positive note on which I think to look into the future beyond the more immediate Faustian deal.
Thank you. Other comments on the questions in particular? Can we use the refugees for help in both in a range of efforts, but in particular in the theater that we're discussing, and also lessons learned from Iraq for military intervention in Syria? General Jones?
Well, to the Russian question, I don't believe Mr. Putin is a strategist. I think he's an opportunist. I think Putin is an opportunist, not a strategist. I think he uses the mischief abroad to deflect the difficulties he's having on the home front financially, economically. Russia's in a deep recession, if I understand things correctly. And frankly, I don't think he can afford to do much more than what he's doing now. To answer your question about the two-front strategy in Ukraine. You don't hear much about Ukraine right now because it's all been diverted. So it's a limited amount of mischief, but it's mischief nonetheless, and it's complicating. As to the role and the threat, role of Europeans and the threat to EU, you know, if you really want to see matters get worse, just continue doing what we're doing right now. And you will see a domino effect on the African continent. And if you think the exodus from the Middle East to Europe was something that you didn't like, you wait till the tidal wave from Africa starts coming, and it'll come towards Europe. So I deeply believe that it's time to really come together on this, to think proactively, to think how you prevent future conflict, and to help struggling nations figure out how they provide for their own security, provide some economic incentive for development and good governance and rule of law. As to the lessons of Iraq, I think they're very clear. One is that there was no strategy beyond the fall of Saddam's statue that involved any kind of reconstruction, any kind of economic revival or really clear thinking in terms of what government was going to come into place. There's a flawed we had a flawed belief that the Shia, Sunni, and Kurdish regions would somehow coalesce under Maliki, who was an instrument of Iran, and that's a failed strategy to start with. I think it's very important if you're going to intervene in other countries that you really think it through and more holistically and make sure you have a good partner. Whoever that is, he's got to be, he or she's got to be a good partner if you're going to be successful. If you don't have one, you're going to fail.
Thank you. Last words, Fred or Begüm, especially on this question, the last one, which was excellent, on refugees. How can we use the talents, skills, and knowledge of those refugees?
Yeah, just before I touch upon your question, just a few words on the refugee crisis and Europe's attitude on this. I think the Europeans were a bit late in trying to struggle with the refugee crisis. They just, waited until the refugee crisis appeared on their doorstep. So I can sympathize with Turkey's feelings that Europe failed to understand how serious the situation was. So having said that, again, Soner also talked about a possible agreement between the European Union and Turkey to deal with the refugee crisis, but I still have my question marks on how feasible that is going to be, because money is not the only issue. Those people are putting their lives at risk to leave Turkey for Europe. We've seen a lot of cases. Maybe right now, as we speak, several people are being drowned in the Aegean Sea. So I still have my question marks how a possible agreement with the EU is going to be put into practice, because what power or what initiative is going to convince those people to stay in Turkey, because they're all around Turkey right now, not living in refugee camps. So we have 2 million Syrian refugees inside Turkey right now. So in response to your question on how we can, cooperate with the refugees, that would be, I think, a very far off initiative to take good advantage of the refugees. But the thing is, I think world powers have to strike a balance between the two extremes. One extreme would be shutting the door to all of the refugees, and the other extreme would be letting them all in without any control. So this is what we saw actually during the before and after the Paris attacks, maybe. Also, Turkey has been trying to do more in order to tighten the border control. So I think that we're also seeing some examples, like the U.S. governors are, saying that they no longer want to accept refugees, although the United States has very good examples of, people coming from refugee families. I think that it's up to the leaders who are going to, shape up the public opinion on this. And I am of the opinion that your suggestion would be maybe a far off one, but maybe a good point to start.
2 points. First, I'd like to endorse the view that diplomacy, what happens at the conference table, reflects facts on the ground, and not the other way around. In my view, Russia's diplomatic objective in Syria is to confront President Barack Obama or his successor, ultimately, with a plain binary choice: the barrel bomber or Baghdadi. Choose, Mr. President. I think the Russian military campaign we're seeing so far is entirely consistent with that objective. Russia has occasionally hit ISIS targets, but for the most part it's hit non-ISIS targets. Again, something to watch. Will this campaign shift to southwestern Syria? If it does, it may provoke the King of Jordan, to do something along the lines of intervention, because what he fears more than anything else is a major refugee flow, again, headed in his direction. So watch that space. On the question of refugees, all I'd like to say is that I consider the nativist reactions of some American political figures to be regrettable and even disgraceful. I have a daughter and son-in-law who work in Munich, who live nearby, who have adopted a young Syrian family from Homs, and I'm very proud of them for doing so.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, panelists. Before we really thank the panelists, a couple of quick notes. There's a reception in the lobby directly outside this room, 6:30 to 7 o'clock. Please join. If you're able, the next session begins at 7 o'clock p.m. on managing cyber risks in an era of pervasive technology. It should be extremely interesting and extremely relevant to almost anything one does. That'll be located back here in this room, and then please remember, wear your credentials at all times. And also please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists today.